Ryan Kenton wasn't the type of man who made noise for attention. He didn't need anyone's approval, and he certainly didn't waste time explaining himself. At 62, his days of justifying anything were long behind him. He'd spent most of his adult life working infrastructure across the country. Bridges, culverts, fire roads in states no one visited unless something flooded or caught fire. He understood dirt, slope, gradient, and weight better than he understood most people. And when his older brother passed the previous fall, leaving him the 30-acre family tract near the eastern edge of Maple Hollow, he didn't hesitate. He loaded his truck, hired 2 hands from a crew he trusted, and moved on to the land with one goal: rebuild what his brother had neglected and put the land to work again. The tract wasn't a fantasy property. No manicured lawn, no white fencing or columns. It was raw, old country, split by a rocky ridge and thick with cedar and black locust. But it had potential. It always had. The house was nothing more than a derelict frame, but the private access road, a twisting gravel path that wound through a dense hollow and across a seasonal creek, had been laid down by their father himself back in the 70s. That road was personal. It was carved into the family's history with a bulldozer, sweat, and a belief in long-term ownership. And by all legal records still on file with the county clerk, that road and everything it touched belonged to Ryan now, independent from the suburban sprawl that had grown around it over the past decade. So when he first returned in early spring, hauling a 20-foot flatbed loaded with reclaimed oak beams and hydraulic tools, he didn't expect trouble. There had always been talk of community rules from the nearby development, but his brother had made it clear their land had never opted into the association. The tract predated zoning lines. It was unincorporated fringe, a legal buffer too small and strange to interest bureaucrats and too private to fall under neighborhood oversight. The only real issue had ever been the terrain itself, but Ryan knew how to shape land. What he didn't know, what he wasn't prepared for, was the level of silent warfare waged not by weather or wilderness, but by the kind of people who wore pastel in winter and believed their landscaping ordinances held the force of gospel. It started, as these things often did, without a single word. No warning, no knock at the door or letter in the mailbox. Just absence. The road, which had been clear 3 days prior, was now blocked. Not with a chain or cones, but with a newly erected steel-reinforced fence, painted a sterile gray and anchored directly into the gravel at both ends. It wasn't a standard gate. There was no latch or keypad, just welded seams, bolted plates, and a freshly mounted placard that read, "Temporary Restricted Zone. Community Environmental Enhancement Initiative. Trespassing will result in legal action." Ryan sat in his truck for nearly 5 minutes, engine running, staring at the sign like it might vanish if he blinked slowly enough. It didn't. The fence wasn't just a barrier, it was a statement. And the worst part wasn't the audacity of it. It was the precision. The gravel had been raked evenly around the base. The vertical beams were powder-coated. Whoever installed it hadn't rushed. They'd taken their time. They wanted it to look permanent. He put the truck in park and stepped out, boots crunching over the crushed limestone, eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing. No sound but the breeze and the distant hum of a riding mower somewhere over the ridge. He walked the length of the barrier, 20 feet across, 3 feet deep into the earth, and just tall enough to discourage climbing. He didn't try to rip it out. He didn't take a photo. He didn't shout or curse. He just stood there, jaw tight, one hand on his hip, the other shading his eyes as he inspected the detail of what was clearly an illegal occupation of his land. Back at the trailer he'd parked higher on the hill, he pulled out his binder of property documents. The original deed from 1971, the 2009 boundary survey his brother had ordered, and a notarized easement release filed when the county had officially removed the road from its maintenance responsibility. All of it pointed to one conclusion. The land was his. The road was private. There was no legal mechanism that allowed anyone to build on it without his consent, which meant someone had ignored or erased those records, or worse, believed they could operate outside them. Ryan didn't lose sleep over it that night. He'd lived long enough to recognize when something was a bluff. But he also knew how bluffs turned into claims if you didn't push back hard enough, fast enough. In his line of work, you didn't wait for permits to catch up. You moved with them. He made a list, printed 2 copies of the property documentation, and drove to the county office first thing the next morning. He wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for someone to tell him it was all a mistake, that a contractor had misread a plot number, that it would be cleared by Friday. That wasn't what he got. The woman behind the glass partition was polite, but her fingers paused ever so slightly when he handed her the address. She clicked her mouse, squinted at her screen, then frowned. "You're not listed as within the district boundary," she said, "but there's a note on the parcel. Something about a provisional access restriction filed last month. Not from us, from a third party." "A third party, like who?" Ryan asked. She didn't answer right away, just tapped a few more keys and shrugged. "It says Community Board Overlay." "That's not our term. Might be one of the developments. I'd have to escalate the request." "Escalate it," Ryan said evenly. "Escalate everything you need." 2 hours later, he left the office with more questions than answers and a single sheet of paper, a facsimile of a filing marked Temporary Environmental Modification under a community plan that, as far as he could tell, had no jurisdiction over his land. It was a move so clumsy and arrogant it bordered on satire, but it wasn't funny, because it was working. He couldn't move equipment in, couldn't receive deliveries, couldn't finish clearing the northern access road. That's when it clicked for him. This wasn't about trees or aesthetics. This wasn't a neighborhood dispute or a misfiled permit. This was something coordinated, quiet, strategic, and backed by the kind of people who didn't need to win legally if they could stall you into surrendering. Ryan wasn't a conspiracy theorist. He didn't believe in shadow councils or corporate cabals. But he knew land. He knew leverage. And he knew when someone was betting on the idea that a man wouldn't fight for what he owned if they just made it inconvenient enough. It had worked on others, he was sure. Not on him. Back on the hill that night, Ryan poured himself a glass of cold water, sat on the metal steps of his trailer, and watched the sun drop behind the fence line. He could see it now, the shape of the conflict forming. Not a battle of fists or lawsuits, but of time, patience, and pressure. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to threaten. All he needed was to hold the line long enough to make sure they knew. If they built on his land, they'd have to answer for it. Not with drama, not with spectacle, but with consequence. The morning after his visit to the county office, Ryan Kenton rose early. The air was still cool, clinging to the dampness of overnight dew, and the sun was only just beginning to edge past the cedar ridge. He stood with a thermos of black coffee in his hand, looking out across the flat stretch that led to the blocked road. The fence was still there, unmoved, unchanged, as if to make a point. He had expected as much. Bureaucracy didn't move overnight, especially not when no one wanted to admit they'd overstepped. What he hadn't expected, however, was the red flag fluttering on the ground just beyond the barricade. It was the kind of marker used by surveyors, thin plastic, stuck into the soil with a wooden stake labeled with Sharpie. Community line, temp. Ryan set his coffee down and crossed the clearing in slow, deliberate steps. He crouched near the flag, tracing the edge of freshly disturbed earth with his fingers. There was no mistaking it. Someone had driven survey markers into his land during the night. Quietly, without permission, without notice. He followed the flags, spaced about 10 feet apart, running a lazy arc from the edge of the fence back toward the tree line that bordered his workshop pad. They weren't just outlining a project. They were redrawing a boundary. That was the moment when irritation hardened into something sharper. It wasn't about a fence anymore. It was about intent. Someone had made the conscious decision to treat his land like contested space, and they were moving swiftly and quietly to establish control. He turned back to the trailer, grabbed his phone, and called the surveyor he'd spoken with once before, Nathan Griggs, a precise, straight-talking man whose father had mapped most of the original county tracts back in the 70s. Ryan didn't bother with pleasantries. He asked him to come out that day, bring his full equipment, and prepare for a formal property boundary confirmation. Griggs agreed, though not without a curious pause. Ryan spent the rest of the morning walking the perimeter with a notepad, jotting coordinates, tree lines, drainage slopes, any detail that could be documented if needed. By noon, Griggs arrived in a dusty white SUV, his assistant trailing behind with a steel tripod and GPS gear. They worked in near silence for 3 hours, marking old survey points, comparing the digital plot with the original deed scans, and measuring offsets down to the inch. When they finished, Griggs pulled Ryan aside and showed him the results on a tablet. The conclusion was clear. The fence was built 7 meters inside Ryan's property line. Not only that, but the line of red flags intersected with 2 registered utility easements, one belonging to the local power authority, the other to a water runoff management system that Ryan's brother had established years ago. Griggs offered to file the report officially, and Ryan nodded, jaw set. This wasn't speculation anymore. This was trespass, plain and simple. And whoever had orchestrated it had either skipped every required check or believed Ryan wouldn't have the resources or presence of mind to fight back. They were wrong. As the survey crew packed up, Ryan placed a call to a real estate attorney he'd worked with during his contracting days in another state. A woman named Donna Meacham, known for her tenacity and unflinching tone. She answered after 3 rings, and when he explained what had happened, she asked for photos, documents, the surveyor's findings, and anything that showed a change in access. "We'll issue a cease and desist for encroachment," she said. "But if they keep pushing, we go civil. You've got legal standing. Make sure you document everything." Over the next 48 hours, Ryan followed her advice to the letter. He photographed every inch of the fence. He recorded a walkthrough of the flagged boundary line, narrated in calm, factual terms. He printed copies of every legal document he had and placed them in plastic binders, labeled by category. He wasn't building a case out of emotion. He was preparing a formal, strategic response. On the 3rd day, he mailed out registered letters to the local office of the association, the district council, and the Code Enforcement Division, each accompanied by copies of the new survey, a declaration of property lines, and a demand for immediate removal of the unauthorized barrier. The response came not by letter, but by omission. No reply, no acknowledgement, just silence. And then, on the 5th day, a new development. Ryan returned from a supply run in town to find a paper taped to the side of the fence, a laminated notice printed on heavy stock. It read, "Notice of Environmental Review. Pathway under temporary mitigation." There was no date, no signature, no contact information, just a QR code and a paragraph citing an obscure code about land access adjustments for transitional zones. He scanned the code. It led to a generic page on the association's website, filled with vague language about sustainability, pedestrian wellness, and ecological renewal. It was absurd. Worse than that, it was evasive. And Ryan knew the purpose. The notice wasn't meant to inform him. It was meant to look official enough to discourage outside questions, to buy time. Delay was a tactic. Delay gave the other side space to rewrite the terms of a fight while you were still defining the rules. He wasn't going to give them that chance. He called Donna again. She listened carefully, then told him to escalate. "Send them one final notice, 3 days to comply. Then we move to legal enforcement. And Ryan, don't remove it yourself. Yet." He followed her advice, even as the weight of the situation pressed down harder each day. His road remained closed. Delivery trucks rerouted or canceled. Contractors refused to proceed without clear access. His timeline slipped. his budget strained. The damage wasn't theoretical anymore. It was tangible, measurable. He made notes of every dollar lost, every hour delayed. The property, once humming with the momentum of restoration, sat in frustrated silence. Machinery idle, materials exposed to weather. And through it all the fence stood firm, unbothered, unreadable, a gray wall that marked not just a physical blockade, but an institutional dare. Do something. Ryan didn't react with heat. He reacted with calculation. On the morning of the third day after the final notice, he contacted a licensed demolition contractor he had worked with in Arkansas years ago, now operating a crew 2 counties over. He didn't ask for favors. He asked for availability, cost, and discretion. The man, Clay Roberts, remembered him well. They spoke for 15 minutes, and by the end of the call, Ryan had a date, a machine, and a crew ready to mobilize at his word. Still, he waited. He gave the association every legal courtesy, every chance to correct the mistake, to step back with some dignity. But none came. No calls, no visit, no acknowledgement. Just more silence, more flags, more subtle movements in the soil as if the land itself was being groomed into a different narrative. Then came the invitation. A flyer appeared in his mailbox, hand-delivered, glossy and colorful. Community Connectivity. Picnic. This Saturday, 12 p.m. It was to be held on the clearing near the fence line, complete with food trucks, acoustic music, and a community pathways unveiling. Ryan stared at the flyer for a long time. They weren't just ignoring his claim, they were celebrating over it. Publicly. Boldly. And now they were turning his road, his land, into a stage. That was their move. He knew it, and he had his. The day before the picnic arrived with a sky heavy and low, clouds hanging like an unspoken warning. Ryan Kenton stood beside his flatbed trailer, hands braced on his hips, looking out across the stretch of land that had once been the clean gravel curve of his private road. Now it was a scarred, unnatural corridor defined not by the shape of the land but by steel fencing, artificial plantings, and a collection of poorly driven survey stakes, half of them tilted, all of them defiant. The silence that had greeted his cease and desist had not been passivity. It had been calculation. They hadn't backed off because they didn't need to. They were creating facts on the ground faster than the system could catch up. And now they were inviting families, news photographers, and real estate scouts to eat shrimp tacos and take selfies on what was, indisputably, still his land. It was a provocation wrapped in bunting and polite community language. But it was a provocation nonetheless. Ryan didn't spend that morning pacing or brooding. He spent it in action. The demolition contractor, Clay Roberts, arrived just before 11 with 2 men and a Cat compact dozer strapped tight to a flat trailer. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Clay had worked for Ryan before. He knew the rhythm. He knew the stakes. Ryan handed him the final certified copy of the property survey and the temporary demolition permit he'd pulled through the county using an emergency obstruction clause. The documentation was precise, legal, and freshly time-stamped. He also handed Clay a map with a single hand-drawn line across it, an arc that traced from the base of the blocked entry to the middle of the field now marked as the picnic staging zone. Clay gave one slow nod, took a long look at the fence, and turned to his men. By noon, the dozer was off the trailer and idling quietly behind the trees, while the picnic crew across the field assembled folding chairs and staked colorful streamers into the soft soil. Ryan changed into a plain gray shirt and worn work boots, pulled his old canvas jacket over his shoulder, and walked the length of his boundary one more time. He passed the red flags, the laminated notices, the painted arrows on the gravel indicating pedestrian corridor, as if someone had authority to rewrite reality. He noted the positions of 2 white canopies set up beside a food truck and a long wooden table where a woman was arranging cutlery. A few children were already chasing each other along the edge of the fence, their laughter innocent but misplaced. It struck him how completely the illusion had taken hold. People really believed this space was theirs. They believed the language of community pathways and activation zones had some invisible force of law. They believed so completely in fact that they no longer saw the man who actually owned the soil under their feet. At 12:30 sharp, the music started. Acoustic guitar, light percussion, some smiling man in a floral shirt announcing raffle prizes over a small PA system. Ryan remained unseen beneath the cover of trees, beside Clay and the dozer. He checked his phone one last time. No response from the board. No reply to the final notice. No withdrawal of the fence. The clock had run out. He gave a single nod. Clay climbed into the cab. The machine groaned to life. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't loud at first. The dozer rolled forward with deliberate, controlled force, its blade lifted slightly to avoid digging too deep into the terrain. The first panel of fencing crumpled with a sharp metallic snap, folding beneath the slow weight of hydraulics and steel. The sound carried, sudden, unnatural in the cheerful noise of the picnic. Heads turned. The man at the microphone stuttered, unsure if it was part of some unseen performance. Ryan stepped out from the trees behind the machine, his presence solid and calm, his boots sinking slightly into the soft ground as he advanced at an even pace. No shouting, no theatrics, just precision. The second panel fell, this time with a louder crash, drawing a gasp from the woman at the table. One of the volunteers moved forward, raising her hand and shouting something indistinct, but the dozer didn't slow. The path had been marked. The documents had been delivered. Ryan carried the final copy of the order in his hand, visible and certified. As the third and fourth fence sections toppled, several guests moved back instinctively, gathering near the far edge of the clearing. Clay adjusted the angle of the blade, pushing the twisted metal aside without breaking pace. A man in a beige vest stormed forward, arms wide, yelling at Ryan about private property and safety and children nearby. Ryan stopped, his voice calm but clear. "You're standing on my land. You've been served notice. I suggest you move." The man hesitated. He didn't look at the documents Ryan held out. He just stared at the machine and stepped back, eyes scanning for someone else to intervene. By the time the dozer reached the picnic tables, the event was in chaos. Food was left abandoned, folding chairs overturned. The guitarist had stopped playing. A few brave souls tried to argue, shouting that this wasn't necessary, that there had to be another way, but they were shouting into inevitability. The path was being restored, not claimed. It wasn't conquest, it was correction. The dozer made one final pass, clearing a 10-foot-wide strip from the base of the ridge to the southern drainage line, exactly as marked in the original plat filed decades ago. Ryan walked the length behind it, flagging the final boundary with fluorescent tape, not for theatrics, but for inspection. He wasn't hiding his work. He was preparing for oversight. It took less than 45 minutes. By the time the dozer shut down and Clay climbed out, sweat streaked across his neck, the clearing was silent. The guests had gone. The organizers stood in a loose huddle, whispering into phones, eyes darting toward Ryan like he was the one who had violated something sacred. No one asked for documents. No one tried to refute what had been done, because they knew, deep down, they had overreached. That evening, as dusk fell and Ryan returned to his trailer, he found a piece of paper wedged under his windshield wiper. It was a citation, issued not by the police, but by the board's own compliance officer. It alleged property damage, public endangerment, and interruption of a registered community event. The letter was unsigned. No badge number, no official jurisdiction. Ryan read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in his binder under nuisance tactics. He poured a glass of water, sat on the steps again, and listened to the stillness. What had begun as an illegal obstruction was now exposed. There was no going back for them. The act of revealing the line, of cutting away the fiction, had restored more than a road. It had re-established reality. Quietly, forcefully, without spectacle. Ryan didn't expect an apology. He didn't need one. He had his road, and the land beneath it was once again connected to the person who respected it. The game had changed, and those who had played it in the shadows were going to have to find a new angle. He didn't smile, he didn't relax, but for the first time in weeks, he wasn't waiting. He was watching. And that, in conflicts like these, was a shift worth everything. The days that followed the demolition were eerily quiet. The road, once suffocated by that steel boundary, now lay open and scarred, its gravel path looking raw and unsettled like a wound freshly exposed to air. Ryan didn't touch the debris for the first 48 hours. He wanted it to stay there, exactly as it was, for any inspector or legal observer who might show up. Twisted steel laid to the side like evidence at a crime scene. No attempt to hide the violence of its removal. But no one came. There were no city workers, no survey teams, no uniformed enforcers demanding explanations. What came instead was stillness, and for Ryan, that silence said more than any complaint letter or threat of litigation. It meant they were regrouping. That silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. He didn't waste time assuming it was over. He had worked too many projects in too many jurisdictions to believe in clean resolutions. Bureaucracies didn't quit. They adapted. He spent the week rebuilding the shoulder of the road, bringing in 2 loads of new gravel, resetting the culvert pipes that had been disturbed by the dozer, and reinforcing the edge with pressure-treated timbers. A contractor friend from a neighboring county helped him reset the gate posts at the lower easement and install a reinforced cattle guard. Nothing hostile, just infrastructure, but every piece placed with the message. This land is managed, not neglected. It wasn't until the 6th day that the next move came, and when it did, it arrived not through the post or under his wiper blade but as a voice on the phone. His lawyer Donna, calling with clipped calm. "You're about to get a notice from Code Compliance," she said. "They filed a complaint with the district, alleging that the soil work you did on the access road constitutes unpermitted grading in a conservation overlay." Ryan didn't respond immediately. He just sat on the step of the trailer, phone pressed to his ear, eyes locked on the road that had been his since he was a teenager. "That overlay doesn't extend to your parcel," he said. "I checked that myself." Donna exhaled. "It didn't until last month. Someone filed a recommendation to extend the overlay to include 3 buffer parcels at the edge of the development. Yours is one. It's under review, not approved. But the complaint claims you disturbed protected runoff zones during active consideration, which makes it a technical violation. It's thin, Ryan, but they want it on the record." It wasn't a direct attack. It was an administrative trap, an attempt to flood the path ahead with enough paperwork and procedural mud to slow him down, to make every movement feel heavy with risk. He had seen it before. In construction, this tactic was used to strangle projects without ever laying a hand on the property. Make the next permit conditional. Make the inspection window tighter. Force delays until investors pulled out or contractors gave up. He had outlasted it before. He would again. Donna told him to respond through official channels only. No verbal exchanges, no emails. Every submission should be physical, time-stamped, and backed with documentation. They want you frustrated. Stay clinical. Ryan did exactly that. He submitted a 12-page rebuttal with attached surveys, the demolition permit, and a topographical map showing 0 impact on the supposed runoff areas. He hand-delivered it to the district office and watched them stamp the front page. The clerk didn't meet his eyes. He didn't expect them to. Their hands were rarely clean in cases like this, and yet what bothered him most wasn't the clerk, or the complaint, or even the fence. It was the architecture of the strategy, the way it twisted words like conservation and enhancement to justify slow theft. This wasn't incompetence. It was precision. That night, Ryan walked the upper path of the property, the one his brother had used for cutting firewood decades ago. The trail was overgrown but still passable, and from the high ridge he could see the full stretch of his land, the winding road below, and the dim perimeter lights of the neighboring community blinking through the trees like quiet sentinels. It struck him then how methodical it had all become. The fence hadn't been the beginning. It had been the middle of a plan unfolding in layers. He remembered something his brother once said during a storm. "They'll never knock the house down. They'll just move the property line until it isn't yours anymore." That memory sat with him for hours. It didn't bring rage. It brought resolve. The road he'd reopened wasn't just a path. It was a symbol of a threshold that someone else had tried to redraw without permission. And now he knew it wouldn't end with that attempt. If they were willing to distort zoning law, manipulate conservation language, and fabricate community outreach events just to seize a sliver of control, then they weren't operating as a committee. They were acting as a machine. And machines didn't retreat. They recalculated. So Ryan began to prepare, not with anger, but with the precision of a builder laying foundation. He contacted the regional office of a licensed environmental engineer and requested an independent soil and hydrology report. He filed for a conditional site evaluation to establish that his restoration efforts were in compliance with all relevant statutes. He hired a local drone operator to conduct weekly aerial documentation of the property. Not for social media, for evidence. Donna reviewed everything, tightening each submission into legal form, crafting a paper wall too precise to be ignored. Ryan didn't posture. He didn't grandstand. He recorded. He measured. He fortified. And in the middle of that quiet, focused escalation, a letter arrived. Unlike the previous threats, this one was polished, formal, and signed. It came from the chair of the Community Development Board, a woman named Celeste Hargrove. She expressed deep concern over recent unilateral actions and warned that continued disruption of adjacent community assets could result in reconsideration of cooperative infrastructure agreements. Ryan read it 3 times. Now they were laying the groundwork to challenge his utility access. That was the move. Not the road. The water line that ran from the south pump station, installed with a handshake agreement and confirmed with a maintenance easement 20 years ago. The line that crossed 30 feet of disputed land before reaching his parcel. He didn't panic. He pulled the original easement agreement from his archive, scanned the map, and called Donna. She confirmed it was binding, but also that it could be challenged if framed as expired through lack of recent use. "You'll need to prove active dependency," she said. "Let's start prepping the affidavit." The middle point of the battle had arrived, not with an explosion but with a slow, steady tightening of the space around him. And Ryan, surrounded not by invaders but by faceless process and manufactured concern, knew what that meant. It wasn't about the fence anymore. It wasn't about aesthetics or soil or runoff. It was about momentum. They wanted to wear him down. And what they didn't understand, what they couldn't possibly know, was that Ryan Kenton had spent his life in storms, literal and legal, and he didn't mind standing in the wind. The first real retaliation came not as a notice or letter but as a sudden absence. One morning, as Ryan prepared to inspect the newly stabilized drainage trench at the base of his lower slope, he turned on the outside tap to fill a bucket and was met with a choking hiss of air. The water line was dry. Not slowed, not reduced, empty. He traced the line to the pressure tank, checked the filters, valves, even the backup connection to the buried reserve cistern. Nothing. For a brief moment he considered a mechanical failure, a blockage, but the readings were clean, the pressure gauge lifeless. He checked the feed tap connecting to the line at the edge of his southern boundary, only to find the valve padlocked shut with a tag from the local water utility citing pending compliance verification. It didn't take a genius to read the move. They were using his dependency, his basic access, as leverage. The language of cooperation was done. They were cutting resources. Ryan didn't curse or call the hotline. He took a photograph of the valve and the tag, then another of the coordinates, and drove straight to the utility office with a physical copy of his easement in hand. The clerk at the front desk blinked at the document like she had never seen a paper map before. She checked her screen, then excused herself and vanished for 20 minutes, returning with a supervisor who said the disconnection had been triggered by a zoning hold submitted by a third-party advisory board pending environmental compliance. Updates. When pressed, the supervisor couldn't provide a statute, only a referral to the city's Infrastructure Review Board, who met bi-weekly, next scheduled date 10 days out. When Ryan asked if the line would be restored before the hearing, the man said, "We can't make adjustments until the board review is complete." Ryan didn't raise his voice. He didn't throw the easement across the desk. He just nodded slowly, took back his papers, and left. Back on the property, he turned on his generator-powered reserve pump and rerouted the filtered water from his cistern system. It wasn't ideal, but it would suffice. He ordered 2 portable tanks for contingency and called Donna. She wasn't surprised. She told him to document everything and file a demand for emergency reconnection under the Essential Utility Clause of the county's Infrastructure Protection Ordinance. He did so the same afternoon and sent a courier to hand-deliver the complaint. But Ryan understood something in his bones that Donna only alluded to in legal language. They were done pretending this was about compliance. They were trying to make him leave, not with bulldozers or lawsuits, with discomfort, with the death of convenience, with the slow erosion of peace. 2 days later, the boundary of the access road was spray-painted with pink arrows and labeled in neon chalk. Soft zone. No heavy equipment. Ryan found it early, just after sunrise, the chalk still wet in spots. There had been no notice, no discussion, no formal signage, just vandalism dressed as civic procedure. That same afternoon, 2 men in orange vests and no name tags showed up in a utility-branded pickup and began walking the perimeter with clipboards, taking photos of soil erosion, snapping shots of the drainage pipe, one of them muttering something about slope impact. Ryan approached, asked for ID. One handed over a printed badge that looked freshly laminated. The name was generic, the agency unfamiliar. When pressed for jurisdiction, the man said they were consultants performing a site observation, under contract with the board's Environmental Safety Commission. When asked for a warrant or documented request, they deflected, claimed they were not authorized to discuss legal parameters. Ryan told them calmly that without documentation, they were trespassing. They left without argument. The message was delivered anyway. That night, Ryan reinforced the perimeter. He didn't put up fences or hang signs. He installed motion sensors along the ridge, pointed downward. He rerouted his trail cams from wildlife corridors to the access road. He logged every hour of unauthorized presence, every shadow that crossed his gate line. When a white SUV circled his eastern trailhead twice after midnight, he recorded the plate. When a spotlight scanned the base of his slope for 30 seconds from a parked vehicle across the road, he made note of the time and submitted a security incident report to the sheriff's office, not for protection, but to put the documentation on. Public record, and still the pressure didn't stop. The next maneuver came as a parcel notice. It was a registered letter claiming a public interest petition had been submitted regarding land reclassification, referencing a clause in the state land code that allowed for temporary use overlays to be placed on underutilized parcels within mixed zoning transition zones. Ryan's property was not part of such a zone. The letter, though formally worded, cited no parcel ID, no filing number, no administrative origin. Donna confirmed it was likely an intimidation tactic meant to simulate official pressure. But the effect was the same. It forced him to respond, to invest time and attention, to maintain constant vigilance. The attrition wore differently than physical conflict. Ryan felt it not as exhaustion, but as fragmentation. Every task took longer. Every day included an interruption. Deliveries missed the mark due to updated routing restrictions. Fuel shipments were rerouted to a holding yard 20 miles away because the access road was listed as limited use. Friends he had planned to hire for seasonal work declined, citing rumors of legal complications and possible media attention. The board wasn't fighting him in the open. They were salting his land with friction. He fought back with the only tools they couldn't dilute: process and precision. Donna escalated the case to a state-level inquiry. She submitted a formal request for investigation into the board's actions under abuse of process statutes. She recommended that Ryan speak not to local officials, but to the district's land use ombudsman. Ryan didn't want a press conference or a protest. He wanted jurisdictional clarity. He sent his file, organized, labeled, cross-referenced, to the ombudsman's office with a cover letter written in plain language. I am a private landowner with clear title, defending legal access from unauthorized interference. I am asking for review. Nothing more. As the second month passed, the board escalated once more, announcing that they would be conducting a comprehensive community survey to evaluate land use perception within the district. The language was pure optics, a soft threat hiding inside a data exercise. But Ryan recognized the shape of it. If they could gather enough resident signatures claiming that his road felt like shared space, they could apply social pressure on the county to review his exemption status. It was manipulation of public sentiment as policy. It was the oldest move in the book. And still, he didn't flinch. Instead, Ryan walked the road each night, flashlight steady, boots deliberate, inspecting the ground like a man watching over a line drawn not in sand, but in years of blood and ownership. He knew every rut, every stone. The gravel beneath his feet wasn't just material. It was memory. It had been laid there by his father, maintained by his brother, and defended now by him not with sentiment, but with systems, with paper, with structure. They could fire every tactic they had, but unless they were willing to dig through granite, they weren't going to dislodge him. And so, as the second escalation settled into an uneasy pause, with hearings pending and filings in motion, Ryan did the only thing he knew how to do. He continued to build. Not just the road, the record, the wall of evidence, the timeline, the map. And with every nail driven into his new boundary marker, every photograph time-stamped, he drove home a message not with noise, but with permanence. You may outlast the careless. You may outmaneuver the weak, but you cannot outwork the prepared. The hearing came on a cold Thursday morning in late October, a date that had shifted twice due to scheduling conflicts and administrative backlog, though Ryan and Donna both knew those were strategic delays meant to weaken their resolve. It was held not in a courthouse but in a district meeting hall, a beige, utilitarian building tucked between a shuttered community theater and a seasonal tax service. The room was lined with folding chairs, most occupied by faces Ryan didn't recognize: development regulars, association loyalists, city planning observers. There was no official opposition per se, but there was a kind of ambient bias, an expectation in the way people tilted their heads and whispered. They'd come not to witness a fair review, but to see a man who had, in their minds, disrupted a consensus. Donna arrived precisely on time, wearing a slate-gray suit and carrying a leather-bound folder so thick it looked engineered for battle. She didn't smile as she approached Ryan. She simply handed him a sheet with key talking points, should he be asked to speak directly. Concise, neutral, defensible. She told him that they weren't here to win through passion, but to corner the narrative with indisputable structure. That meant no stories, no appeals to history or sentiment. Just law, just process, just proof. The chairwoman of the review board, a severe woman with prematurely white hair and an inflexible posture, called the hearing to order. The representatives from the association, the same ones who had authorized the fence, the rerouted utilities, and the compliance claims, took their seats with a calm that bordered on smug. Their speaker, a man in a navy blazer named Arnold Whitford, opened with a presentation full of vague terminology: cooperative planning zones, transitional ecology impact, regional pedestrian safety enhancement. He spoke for nearly 20 minutes and didn't mention Ryan's name once. The implication was clear. This wasn't about a person. It was about shaping land for the collective good. When Donna stood, she didn't raise her voice or waste time. She distributed physical packets to the board members, labeled, indexed, cross-referenced. She outlined the timeline: the original deed, the registered easement, the unauthorized construction, the manipulated conservation filings. She referenced the drone images, the third-party surveyor reports, and the series of recorded evasions and administrative deflections. She ended by pointing directly to the clause in the county code that specified the association's authority boundary, and how every action taken against her client fell well outside it. The room was quiet when she finished. Not in awe, in adjustment. She had shifted the lens of the conversation from collective sentiment to individual legality. Then came the only question of the morning that Ryan was asked directly. One of the board members, a younger man in a striped tie who had spent the entire hearing with a tablet in his lap, asked, "Why didn't you try mediation before escalating to demolition?" It wasn't an accusation. It was a test. Ryan answered the same way he'd moved equipment for decades, steady, without hesitation. He explained the certified letters, the ignored filings, the threats dressed in community language, the padlocked water supply, the planted survey markers, the refusal to meet, and finally, the formal legal notice delivered with a clear compliance deadline. The demolition, he said, was not escalation. It was enforcement. On my land, after all administrative avenues were exhausted. The board member nodded once, then returned to his screen. After a recess and a closed-door deliberation that stretched just under an hour, the board returned. The chairwoman read the decision in full, each word crisp, formal, irreversible. The board had found that the actions of the community association and its representatives constituted unauthorized encroachment. The environmental compliance claims were ruled speculative and unsupported by verified data. The board directed the immediate restoration of Ryan Kenton's full utility access and issued a recommendation to the county office to review the association's procedural conduct. The final point, added almost as a formality, stated that all further action regarding the subject property would require express written consent from the owner and be subject to independent review. Ryan didn't react with relief or satisfaction. He listened carefully, noted the language, and folded the copy of the ruling into the folder Donna handed him. Outside the building, she allowed herself a breath, then said, "They'll retreat now. Not because they agree, but because they got caught." He nodded. That's enough. What followed wasn't celebration. It was cleanup. Over the next 2 weeks, the water line was reconnected. A city maintenance crew removed the rusted base of the illegal fence. The flagged boundary markers vanished overnight, quietly, without admission. No apology came. None was expected. The association didn't issue a statement. They simply stopped showing up. The consultant vehicles disappeared. The drone flyovers ceased. The air over Ryan's land returned to stillness. But it wasn't the same kind of quiet he'd known before. It was a quiet earned through defense. Unshakable, reinforced by stone, law, and time. There were whispers in the neighborhood after that. A few cautious voices said he'd gone too far, that there had to have been another way. But more than a few others, people who had never spoken to him directly, offered silent nods when passing his road. A few sent short notes tucked into folded paper. Glad someone stood up. They tried it on my lot, too. Didn't have the fight in me. One man, older, walked up to his trailer one morning, handed him a folded survey map, and said nothing but, "This used to be mine. Now I rent from them. Don't let them do it to you." Ryan kept those notes in a drawer beside the title deed, not because he needed the affirmation, but because he wanted the reminder. This wasn't just about access. It was about a line, a real one, drawn in gravel and protected not with emotion but with endurance. They had underestimated him. They had thought he would flinch when isolated, that he would bow to quiet pressure, but pressure had never been his weakness. It was where he'd done his best work. The land never looked cleaner. In the weeks following the hearing, the road that had once been hidden behind steel and silence now ran uninterrupted from the base of the ridge to the western drainage channel, resurfaced with compacted gravel and edged with low-stacked stone. Ryan Kenton didn't make an announcement. He didn't paint a sign or stake a flag, but those who passed by, contractors, haulers, even a few residents from the surrounding community, understood without needing to be told that the road had a keeper again. Not a caretaker, a keeper, someone who didn't ask for permission to hold what he owned, someone who simply did. The association didn't try to repair their reputation. They moved on as bureaucracies do, by focusing elsewhere, changing wording, shifting attention to the next initiative, the next line item, the next quiet acquisition. Celeste Hargrove resigned from the Community Development Board citing stress-related health issues. The environmental overlay project stalled and was eventually shelved. The local press, uninterested in the legal minutiae or in painting Ryan as anything other than a private landholder with a permit, let the story die. That suited him just fine. He didn't need their words to define what had happened. The boundaries spoke for themselves. By the first frost of November, he'd reconnected with the construction crew he had initially intended to work with before the blockade. They returned with a backhoe and trenchers, helping him finally install the new foundation piers for the outbuilding that had sat half-finished for months. The frame went up in 4 days, the walls in another 3. Each morning, Ryan stood at the edge of the gravel watching as things fell into place. Not just wood and screws, but momentum, autonomy, time. It wasn't triumph, it was continuity. The quiet relief of resuming what had been interrupted. Neighbors spoke to him more now, some cautiously, others with a kind of guilty admiration. One afternoon, a couple from 2 streets over stopped on their walk and asked gently if he would consider speaking at a meeting about property rights advocacy. Ryan declined, not out of rudeness, but because he understood something many didn't. What he had done didn't need to be retold as a campaign. It needed to stand as a fact, an unmoving one, not a symbol, a line. He had defended it. Others could too, but they would have to choose that for themselves. Donna called him in early December just to say the last paperwork had cleared. The case file was closed. All counterclaims were dropped. The matter was legally dead. He thanked her, then spent the next day out by the lower clearing, reseeding the slope where the fence had first been installed. Not out of symbolism, just maintenance. Just care. He had built his life on structure, not defiance. But when structure was threatened, defiance became necessary. One morning, after a night of freezing rain, he noticed tire tracks near the lower road. Not suspicious, just unfamiliar. He followed them with steady steps and found a folded note tucked into the old gatepost where the mailbox used to stand. It wasn't a threat or complaint. It was a simple handwritten message. "Thanks for holding your ground. I lost mine 5 years ago. Watching you reminded me it's still possible. No name, no return address." Just a quiet echo of what Ryan had come to understand through all of this, that resistance didn't have to be loud to be lasting. It had to be steady. By winter, the land had settled again. The ridge caught snow in jagged angles, and the wind ran low through the trees like it always had. Ryan would sit sometimes by the frame of the workshop, watching the road, not as a guard, but as a witness. He didn't expect them to try again, and if they did, he'd be ready. Not with rage or vengeance, with records, with resolve, with the understanding that land once claimed must be kept, not through noise but through knowledge. No one came to shake his hand. No one gave him a medal. He didn't want one. He had his land, his tools, and his time. And for men like Ryan Kenton, that was enough.